Hello, Year 13. Today we are going to focus on some revision, and we're going to do that through looking at essay technique. So if you log on to Canvas and scroll down to this module, module 3.5, it's called Revision and Exam Practice. And in here you'll see a number of revision support materials, which include some historiography, some essay technique sections, and then also a lot of different exam practice questions that you can have a go at. The one that I'm going to look at today is the evaluate the significance of one intellectual movement in the period 1400 to 1700. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you have an intellectual movement in mind that you're going to study. In my case, I'm going to evaluate the significance of the Renaissance during that period. So the first thing I need to do then is to write up an introduction. An introduction is going to be a brief outline of what it is that I'm going to look at throughout the essay. The period 1400 to 1700 was one of significant change in intellectual movements, the Renaissance being one such movement. The Renaissance was a rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman knowledge that paved the way for an era of inventions, artworks, architecture and development. It was a turning point in the history of man's intelligence. Okay, so in this introduction then, I've just sort of given a tiny bit of context as to what the Renaissance is, and also I've hinted at whether or not I think it's going to be significant. So there are going to be two sides to this essay then. I'm going to first argue that the Renaissance was a significant intellectual movement during the period, but I'm also going to argue the opposite. I'm going to suggest that actually it wasn't as significant as you first might think. Okay, let's start by having a look at my argument for it being significant. So I've written four paragraphs in this instance. The first one is looking at where the Renaissance comes from and why it's significant for that reason. So it says the fall of Constantinople in 1453 sparked the reinjection of classical knowledge into Western society. The Christian professors of Constantinople fled back to Italy and took with them thousands of ancient books containing ideas that had long been censored by the Church. The Renaissance marked an incredibly significant change in thought which lasted until the 16th century. So in this, I'm saying that it's significant because previously this knowledge had been censored and now it was released, and this caused the sparking of a movement that lasts then for a couple of hundred years. My next two paragraphs then, I'm looking for some more specific detail to support my evidence. So I'm going to look at two key thinkers in these paragraphs. The first one is going to be Leonardo da Vinci. The Renaissance enabled men such as Leonardo da Vinci to take centre stage. Da Vinci embodied the model humanist by engaging in a broad array of experimentation that contributed to the brief period of the High Renaissance, which was exemplified by dignified, stable, and often majestic art that Tansey and Kleiner suggested unified and balanced the conflicting experiences of an entire culture. His works in art, anatomy, and invention contributed to an intellectual revolution that supports centuries of developments in these disciplines. So in that paragraph, I've included a historian, so there's some example of historiography there to support my points. And I've suggested that the significance of the Renaissance in this case is its contributions to later developments in disciplines such as anatomy and invention. Okay, the last paragraph then that I'm going to argue for the significance says this. Another example of a Renaissance polymath was Nicolaus Copernicus. His theories on the heliocentric solar system were revolutionary, and his publication of De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, just before his death in 1543, was a major contributor to this intellectual movement. Publication of these developments would not have been possible without there existing a culture for innovation as existed in Renaissance era Europe. So in that case, I'm suggesting that the Renaissance was a cultural movement as well, but one that enabled intellectual innovation. Okay, so now that I've put forward one side of the argument, I'm going to counter-argue so that this is a good argument. Okay, so here is the end of my essay. I am putting forward two counter-arguments, so two counter-argument paragraphs. So if I just show you the whole of the essay, it's actually an introduction, a conclusion, and then 5 paragraphs in the middle, which is perhaps a little bit long for what you would get a chance to write in 45 minutes. But if we're looking at a sort of model example, you're definitely looking at 2 to 3 points in support and 2 to 3 points against. Okay, so the first counter-argument says, however, 19th century Swiss philosopher Jacob Burckhardt was perhaps the first scholar to raise the question of whether a clear divide between the Middle Ages and a so-called Renaissance could really be identified. The Renaissance could be considered a gradual change in thought, the importance of which only really come into fruition with the succeeding movements of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that actuated revolutions in understandings of practice, rather than oversaw centuries of slow change. So in that paragraph then, I'm suggesting that the Renaissance was insignificant because it wasn't really revolutionary. Instead, it was just a slow change that gave way to more revolutionary movements such as the Enlightenment. And my last counter-argument then says, furthermore, it should be considered that the reinjection of knowledge following the fall of Constantinople was an inevitable rediscovery of existing knowledge. Whilst this was significant to a certain extent, it should not be considered great progress. Furthermore, this progress would not have been so widespread without the support of technological developments such as Gutenberg's 1440 printing press that enabled the quick spread of ideas throughout Europe. And so in this paragraph I'm suggesting then that the Renaissance, however significant it was, would not have been significant on its own because it needed to be supported by other developments such as technological developments like the printing press. Okay, so the last part of this essay then, you need to have a conclusion that summarises all of your arguments. It doesn't need to be long because this is obviously timed. It's a timed essay, you only get 45 minutes to write it. So I've written, in conclusion, the Renaissance was a significant intellectual movement because it witnessed the development of great art, literature and invention. However, it was only part of a longer chain of intellectualism and was enabled by the technological development of the age, which limited its significance when viewed in isolation. So, there you have it, an essay that evaluates the significance of one intellectual movement in the period 1400 to 1700.